Hi, I'm Bob the Hollow, and this is the Marketplace of Theories, a series where we're going to talk about other people's theories. If you haven't already, then I recommend you watch the first video in this playlist. It's called Primer, it's really short, and it lays some ground rules to how this experiment is supposed to work. So, today we're going to take a look at some of Jake the Ashen Hollow's theories. He's a prolific uploader, he's been around for a while, and he's got one of the biggest subcounts among lore hunters. He's also kinda giving me a hand when I was starting the channel, and a couple of shoutouts since then, so I figured he'd make a good choice for the first video. His videos with individual theories aren't that long, so instead of talking about a single one of those, I've chosen a few to talk about all at once. And I'll leave links in the description to all the videos being discussed, so don't forget to check those out as well, right? Now, let's get started, shall we? We're going to start with this theory because I think it's important for us to talk about it, seeing that, in my opinion, this theory is actually dangerous. And also because the theory itself and some discussions I've had about it serve to illustrate a couple of points I'd like to make. This theory is meant to explain the Dragonslayer armor in Archdragon Peak. It states that the Ornstein we fought in Dark Souls 1 was an illusion. It's based on the description of Ornstein's soul that says Lord Gwyn granted this soul to his 4 most trusted knights. And its reasoning is that Gwyndolin had used the shard of Gwyn's soul to create such a powerful illusion. Now, the biggest problem I've always had with this theory is that accepting it breaks lore hunting. If you accept Ornstein survived Dark Souls 1 because the Ornstein we fought was an illusion, then you're gonna have to accept that for all other characters we've killed, they might all still be alive because what we killed was, in fact, an illusion. They try to justify that by using the Gwyn Soul Shard argument, but that in and of itself still creates similar problems because, at the very least, all who received such shards, the other 3 out of 4 Knights of Gwyn, the 4 Kings, and Sif, the Scaleless, might still be alive as well. And here's the thing, this argument is based on a mistranslation. The original description of Ornstein's soul never says Gwyn gave them their souls. And without that, we go back to the first problem, where every single character we have ever killed might still be alive somewhere. Anyone would be able to argue that, and nobody would be able to contradict their claims. This theory is dangerous because it utterly breaks lore hunting. So, Ornstein's fight wasn't optional, meaning the fight objectively happened. Not only that, but it also means we won. We defeated Ornstein, and we got his soul. I can't stress this enough. We defeated him in combat, watched his body either go poof or get squished, and then we got his bloody soul. If we kill him last, that is, but either way, the presence of his soul inside that body is still canon. So, I am sorry, but he is dead. Ornstein is just dead. Okay, now, the first point I'd like to make comes from the theory itself, and it relates to how people sometimes go about their lore hunting. And that is by focusing too much on a thin slice of the lore and failing to take the larger picture into account. It's much easier to make everything fit, or seem to fit, when you're just dealing with 1 or 2 variables in close proximity to each other. But the more variables you add to that equation, the more likely your theory is to contradict the lore. But we shouldn't shy away from that. We should always try to accommodate all parts of any given system in its solution. And I wasn't supposed to be giving in-depth alternatives, but I'll make an exception here and use my alternative to this theory as an example. Dark Souls 3 places Ornstein's armor set in Archdragon Peak. And that creates a question, right? If we killed him in Dark Souls 1, then who brought his armor here? That is a valid question in need of an answer. But if we look at the bigger picture, then we'll see the game is also presenting other questions that are all related to it. For instance, Sacred Oath's description in this game adds the following information. This is the tale of the sun's firstborn, his faithful first knight, and the brave dragon slayer who served them both. The faithful first knight is Ornstein, as that's how he's described in the Leo Ring. But then the game is asking us, who is the brave dragon slayer who served him and the Nameless King? Another question comes from Ornstein's buddy, Executioner Smough. His armor in Dark Souls 3 says he was the last knight to stand in defense of the ruined cathedral. But Dark Souls 1 never called him a knight, so the question here is, what's up with calling him a knight now? And finally, there's the Dragon Slayer armor boss on the bridge leading to the Grain Archives. Its soul says the armor itself lost its master long ago, and the question here is, who was the original owner of this armor? All of these questions are related to one another. They all create a system, like the intersecting threads of a tapestry. And we don't necessarily have to find a single solution that can answer all of them at the same time, but I think that in this particular case, we can do just that. If we take Sacred Oath's question, who is the brave dragon slayer who served Ornstein and the Nameless King, and convert it into an answer instead, we can unravel all of these questions at once. The clearly badass owner of the Dragon Slayer armor is Sacred Oath's brave dragon slayer. I mean, we get the miracle at the Sunlight Altar and the boss fight is right there. The game placed both the question and its answer right next to each other. So now we know who the owner of that armor was, but then what happened to him? Well, we still need to answer who brought Ornstein's armor to Archdragon Peak. So the brave dragon slayer abandoned his armor and traded it for Ornstein's, to honor his captain and carry his duty of guarding the cathedral. And now that we have a new knight serving in Ornstein's post, we can go back to Smough's armor. Dark Souls 1 Smough was never called a knight, but if someone picked up Ornstein's armor and duty, then it's reasonable to assume someone did the same for Smough's as well. And if this someone was a knight, then that problem is solved. Smough was never a knight, but the person who picked up his post was. The description ruined cathedral helps to corroborate that, since the cathedral only became ruined after our fight with them. So, whoever was the last knight to stand in its defense had to have done so after we killed both Smough and Ornstein in Dark Souls 1. And lastly, since Sacred Oath's brave dragon slayer served both Ornstein and the Nameless King, after NK founded Archdragon Peak, he left Anorlondo to reunite with his last remaining captain. Problem solved, all questions have been answered, there's no need for retcons. And now the second and last point I wanted to make here. This one comes from discussions I've had over the years about this theory, and it's related to how adamant some people seem to be in defending Illusion Ornstein. And let me be perfectly clear, you're under no obligation to agree with me on any of this. But when new information is presented regarding something you believe, you owe it to yourself to reevaluate your beliefs in this new light, to see if it still holds true or not. And unless you have a vested interest in its perpetuation, then it's okay for that belief to be wrong. You just shake the dust off and move on. Find another answer instead. Jake doesn't use the word reincarnation in this video, but he seems to be implying it. That is a very common interpretation, after all. So, based on that assumption, the reincarnation theory is meant to explain the old souls in Dark Souls 2, and it simply states that the old lords of Lordran had reincarnated in Drangleic. The thing is, we neither absorbed nor crafted from those Lord souls. We placed them in the Lord vessel. That means they weren't destroyed. They continued existing in the world as they were, so they couldn't reincarnate. And also, I think it's safe to assume they were later physically transported to Drangleic, which can be deduced by the broken Lord vessel found in Majula. In this theory, Jake claims Rosaria to be both Guinevere and the Queen of Lothric. I agree, Rosaria was the Queen of Lothric, but not that she was Guinevere. I think she was Fina, Guinevere's mother instead. He starts by making the case for Guinevere as the Queen of Lothric, and lists the Divine Blessings and the Sun Princess Ring as evidence. Divine blessings are a problem because the original description says the Queen of Lothric was compared to a goddess of fertility, and a comparison by definition requires considering the similarities between two or more things, meaning the queen and said goddess of fertility were two different entities. Regarding the ring, Jake draws attention to both being said to have raised several heavenly children, but since the Queen of Lothric is being compared to Guinevere, it's only reasonable they'd both be described similarly, especially where it pertains to the similarities being drawn between them, that is, their fertility, which makes it not at all strange they'd both be described as having raised several heavenly children. The theory then continues to make this case through the dancer of the Boreal Valley, who Jake believes to be a daughter of Guinevere. He draws this conclusion from the dancer's crown and the miracle soothing sunlight, which we get by transposing her soul. The miracle was granted to the maidens of Guinevere, and he thinks maiden could have the meaning of daughter in this context. And even though that seems like a bit of a stretch to me, it's also not impossible, but the problem is the original description uses the word Seijo, which means sent, not daughter, and is quite unambiguous, as far as I know, at least. And the crown is said to be an article of the old gods, permitted only for direct descendants of the old royal family. Well, I think the royal family they're talking about is Dusk's, who was the princess of Ulasil and therefore also a member of an old royal family with ties to an Orlando, and whose ring is currently lost in Sullivan's Irithyll dungeon. So, regarding Guinevere as the Queen of Lothric, so far the arguments are all, at best, flimsy and circumstantial, at worst just kinda wrong. Next, Jake makes a case for Rosaria as the Queen of Lothric. And since we both agree with this conclusion, I think there's no need to waste time on it, right? Moving on, the last part of the theory concerns Rosaria as Guinevere. Here, Jake mentions bountiful sunlight, which, unlike soothing sunlight, was changed from Dark Souls 1 to 3 so that it makes no mention of being granted to maidens of Guinevere, only of being granted by Guinevere. Well, I think it doesn't mention maidens because then It confused people into thinking Rosaria was once a maiden of Guinevere. And I think these miracles always say granted by Guinevere instead of created by Guinevere, because they were created by her mother, Fina, and then passed down to Guinevere, just like Gwyn passed down his lightning miracles to the Nameless King. In his closing arguments, Jake mentions the Obscuring Rings description that says Rosaria was robbed of her tongue by her firstborn, and he believes this doesn't have to mean her tongue was literally removed. But it kinda does, though. It just really kinda does, though. The game is being very explicit about it, both in the description and the act of giving her literal tongues. Even more so in Japanese, where the word translated as robbed is ubao, which just means that, to rob or steal. And the ring itself is actually named Genshi no Yubi wa, which means ring of the phantom limb. The phantom limb in question being, of course, her tongue. And in order to reach its conclusion, this theory also fails to address the following questions. Why would Guinevere be the leader of an invading covenant now? Why did her firstborn steal her tongue? Where did she go after she left Orlando, and why did she come back? What happened to Flan? And no, saying it's a retcon or they just divorced doesn't really answer the question, it just avoids the question. Why did she leave Lorien and Lothric behind? What is the deal with both her twisted, red-stricken soul and the black eye orb? Lothric's throne ritual is a farce, since it transports you to the future when Lothric has already fallen to ruin, meaning it was never meant to save the world after all. With that in mind, why did she support the throne ritual? Why did she change her name to Rosaria? And last but definitely not least, whatever happened to her amazing chest ahead? So, I think those counter-arguments are already enough to cast some doubt on the validity of this theory's conclusions, and I think these questions that were not answered kind of break the theory, so yeah. Next up is the Lothric Curse, but before we get to that one, if you want more elaborate versions of my theories regarding Guinevere and the Queen of Lothric, then you should watch Primordial Flame, Vereor Nox of Gods and Monsters, The Good, the Bad and the Rotten, and Bloodlines. Yeah, I know that's a lot, but it's only if you're interested, so moving on. Here, Jake is arguing for the need to create a worthy heir to the Lothric bloodline that can be used to link the first flame. And this is the jumping point to the rest of the theory, which claims Prince Lothric to have been an incest baby between Gwyndolin and Guinevere, who was also stuck full of humanities in the form of the pus of man in order to make him better kindling for the first flame. The problem here is that, as I mentioned before, Lothric's throne ritual is a farce, a sham. Even if Prince Lothric had agreed to take his role as a Lord of Cinder, he was never going to link the first flame. The ritual itself doesn't link anything, it just takes us to the future. Just like the Lord Souls in Dark Souls 1, which weren't used in the linking itself, they were just used to open the path to the kiln of the first flame. This then leads us to the second reason the ritual is a sham, because the people of Lothric believe the ritual is meant to save their world, but it won't. It won't because it doesn't let you link the first flame in the present, only in the future. By the time we get to the first flame, Lothric is already long gone. The throne ritual was never meant to save them. Not to mention the inscription on the throne itself mentions a King Lothric, not the prince. Osiris was originally meant to be the Lord of Cinder, but after he refused, Prince Lothric became the backup plan. So, This theory is trying to answer a question from the perspective of someone who has bought into the farce. It's trying to answer what made Prince Lothric worthy of linking the first flame, when he was never meant to do that at all. Which then makes the whole thing kind of an unnecessary exercise. But even if you choose to carry on ignoring the sham, there are still a few problems here. First, the move to incest seems to me like a big jump in conclusions, without enough evidence to support that. Second, if Lothric was cursed with semi-undeath, then why is it that only Lorien comes back to life? Also, how did Lorien embrace his brother's curse? And regarding his final thoughts, I too used to think Lorien had made this choice for his little brother's sake. But the thing is, Lothric is the one keeping Lorien alive, not the other way around. So I think it's more likely they joined their life forces to save the Elder Prince instead, who was probably gravely wounded in his fight against the Demon Prince. Remember that there are still demons roaming around that area, so that fight happened either just before or at the same time as shit really hit the fan for Lothric Castle. Not to mention, if Lorien wanted to protect Lothric, he'd be better off not becoming a cripple, so he could better fight for him. Just saying, you know? Jake's theory is that Filianor was the first Firekeeper, mentioned in the item Eyes of a Firekeeper. His reasoning here is that Filianor is a Firekeeper because she tends to the dark sign, which has been either literally or figuratively placed upon the dark soul, and that seeing a world without the first flame through a fit of prescience caused her to lose her eyes, which were her light, and so losing her eyes/light invited darkness to grow from her eye sockets, and that Filianor's eyes are the very same item Eyes of a Firekeeper that were later passed around Firekeepers from Lothric. Let's start with a quick side note. Regarding Firekeepers as prisoners, I'd just like to point out that the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3 is an actual prisoner to the Shrine's curse, which is mentioned by the Shrine Handmaid and explains both the obnoxious fog walls and why NPCs get teleported to the shrine upon being invited. Though, as he mentioned himself, maidens do seem to vie for the position out of their own accord. Now, the first problem is that this theory doesn't explain how Filianor lost her eyes. She saw what was to come, and then she just lost them. How did she lose her eyes? Did they just plop out of her head, or did somebody remove them? After she lost them, this theory also doesn't explain who took them away, and how did they end up in Lothric. Also, this theory just throws it out there that losing her eyes caused literal darkness to grow out of her eye sockets. It can't be just about losing one's eyes, right? What kind of light are we talking about here? Did she lose her soul? Did she put her soul inside her eyes? What did she lose that caused darkness to grow from inside her body? This just seems like it would need some clarification, you know? You can't just throw a statement like this out there, not explain it, and expect it to make sense. When it comes to Filianor being a Firekeeper at all, she's just kinda not. It seems like a big stretch to claim she was a Firekeeper based on her role of keeping the Dark Soul at bay. That role kinda had nothing to do with the dark sign, really. And, honestly, there's a bonfire right in front of her. I'd be more amenable to calling her a firekeeper if he had claimed she was tending to that bonfire, which, again, right in front of her. Though I would still need evidence for that claim as well, but, it's right in front of her. I think the first firekeeper mentioned in those eyes is the first Lothric firekeeper, not the first one of all firekeepers ever. The betrayal in the darkness in the world without flame, all of that happened in the Untainted Graves itself, which is in the past and also a big stretch of darkness, kinda like what we get with the betrayal ending. Meaning the active duty firekeeper of that time tried to do the same thing ours does. This is a much, much simpler explanation. You don't even have to leave the area where we find those eyes to begin with. This video explains a theory wherein the Profaned Flame is the old chaos. The monstrosities of sin are shards of Manus, and the profaned capital was built on top of the ruins of Ilion Lois. It all starts with Eleonora stating the monstrosities were relatives of a certain oracle, whom Jake believes to have been Alsana, the silent oracle. The first thing I need to point out is that the children of the Abyss were not shards of Manus. This widespread idea came about because Manus was called the Father of the Abyss in English, which would imply he had created it, and would fit the children moniker quite well. But in Japanese, he was called the Lord of the Abyss, not its father. So, yes, they are shards of the Abyss, but the Abyss is much more than just Manus. The next thing I'll point out is that there is another oracle right there, on top of the same building where the monstrosities reside. Jake himself even mentions these sorcerers were oracles once. There are also some questions left open by this theory, such as if the monstrosities were, indeed, all children of the Abyss, then why don't they look and or operate like the others did? Why aren't they looking for their own personal monarchs to leech from? Also, what exactly is their curse, and how did it trigger the Profaned Flame? And definitely not least of all, how is the capital supposed to be Ilion Lois? I mean, I get the lands are churning and all, as Emma puts it, and that eventually the lands of Drangleic will converge upon Lordran, as seen in the Drag Heap. But that is such a way ways from now, and it looks so messy. How is Ilion Lois supposed to have comfortably snuggled beneath an Orlando? How does that work? So, yeah, given these questions and the presence of oracles in the profaned capital, I just think this theory is stretching it a little bit. If you want to check out my own interpretation of the Profaned Flame, that would be in the Book of Curses video I released recently. This video's title is self-explanatory, right? And the explanation proposed for what is a Lord of Hollows is that Kaf had the Sable Church grant dark sigils to the Champion of Ash, so that said champion could have enough dark within themselves to snuff out the first flame. I guess most people watching this already know of Kaf's involvement with the Sable Church, and yes, they do grant dark sigils. That's just common knowledge, right? The problem with this theory, I think, comes from overlooking many of the aspects related to this subject, and from its conclusion being a bit of an oversimplification. So, one of the first things he mentions is that none of the other primordial serpents along with Kaf in the original Dark Lord ending were named, but they literally say let Kaf and Frampt serve your highness, We are here to serve your highness. So, yeah, at least one of those other serpents was named. And this is also the first thing being overlooked. Why were Kaf and Frampt working together? Then, we'd still have unanswered questions such as, what is the Dark Sigil? Why can pilgrims grant them? Why don't the Unkindled Hollow without the Dark Sigil? And why does the Lord of Hollows need to be unkindled in the first place? I think these are all kind of important questions to answer when you're trying to explain what the Lord of Hollows is. And going back to the serpents, I think the crux of the matter here is why would the primordial serpents be so invested in the Age of Man? Jake doesn't tackle that question, but I think he should have. If the serpents are trying to make a Lord of Hollows, then why are they doing that? What's in it for them? It can't be all for nothing, right? They wouldn't have spent eons playing this stupid game if it was all for nothing. And I know it's tempting to always make ourselves the protagonist. Basically, every story with non-human sentient species does that. Humans are always the most super special of the bunch. But just try and look at the rest of Dark Souls, and try to realize you're not supposed to take anybody at face value. Every time anybody tells you to do something, you should always ask, yeah, cool, but why though? And in this particular instance, I think that's kind of the key to answering what's a Lord of Hollows. And just a quick last side note here, according to his own reasoning, any and all Firekeepers are eligible to become the Lord of Hollows, since he says they possess infinite humanity and that a near endless supply of it is necessary for the making of one such lord. So, unless I missed some finer detail there, his own argument seems to defeat the purpose for his whole theory. If you want my take on the specifics regarding Dark Sigils and Unkindled Ash, the Book of Curses video covers that as well. This last video we're going to cover tries to explain what is the first sin, and it starts by saying Auria's dialogue is the reason many people believe the first sin to be winds prolonging the Age of Fire, either through the linking of the first flame and or the undead curse. Then the video comes up with two alternatives in the end, saying the first sin is either Izalith's creation of the Chaos Flame or Gwyn's betrayal of both Filianor and the Pygmies. Most of the runtime here is spent connecting Auria to a research into chaos, and I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with all of his arguments getting there, but we agree he studied chaos to some extent, yes. I think that's kind of self-evident in-game, right? Though, yeah, figuring out the nuts and bolts is always fun. The problem, I find, is considering Izalith for the slot of first sin. A sin? Sure. The first sin? Not quite. That just flies in the face of everything Auria has to say about anything ever. Jake kinda acknowledges that in the end, by briefly mentioning Gwyn, Filianor and the Pygmies, and I just wish he had spent more time chasing Gislead instead. So, both Vendrick and Auria wanted to overcome the curse of the undead. That was a part of their goals. Auria also says he sought to shed the yoke of fate, which he describes as men abandoning their immortality for the illusion of life, based on an artificial impairment that was attached to our naturally immortal selves. So, yeah, the dark sign and the betrayal of the Pygmies seem like a good starting point. But the thing is, Auria seeks answers that lie beyond the scope of light and dark. He doesn't care about either Age of Fire or Dark. He doesn't care about the Throne of Want or the Kiln of the First Flame. So Auria's first sin can't be just about Dark Sign and postponing the Age of Man either. It has to go deeper than that. And Jake's theory unfortunately just doesn't go that far. If you want my full perspective on it, I have a first sin video as well, which also kinda covers the whole what is a Lord of Hollows thing we just talked about. So that's what I got for now. I think Jake has some very interesting ideas, but I feel like there's a bit of a tendency to jump to conclusions without adding the necessary pieces of evidence between those steps. In any case, remember to watch Jake's videos if you haven't, and to watch mine as well if you're interested in my opinions. Feel free to let me know if I missed something in his arguments or to just leave any questions or comments. Also, this new format is uncharted territory for me, so feel free to leave suggestions as well. They will be greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much for watching. A very big thanks to all my patrons, John, Ethan Finlay, Sinclair Lore, Balan, Several Bets, Tyler Baldwin, and Chris, etc. Until next time, stay safe and see you around.